Marcus thought I was nothing more than a harmless old man, the kind who could be fooled with a polite smile and a few empty compliments. He didn't know that years as a school principal had taught me to read people like open books. Late at night, when Lena was asleep, I'd hear the soft creak of my study door. Marcus would tiptoe in, convinced I was lost in dreams, rifling through drawers as if my life's worth could be reduced to trinkets and loose change. But on that particular night, he finally found what he was looking for, or so he thought. His fingers closed around the small brass key I'd left in the top drawer, right where he could find it. He crept to the safe, unlocked it, and swung the heavy door open. A second later, a sharp hiss and a blinding red burst filled the room. The dye splattered across his face and clothes, staining him in a mark that wouldn't fade quickly. I watched from the shadows, my lips curling into a quiet smile. Before we go further, do ensure to subscribe to this channel and also let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. They arrived on a wet Tuesday afternoon, the kind of Portland day where the rain feels like it seeps into your bones. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching their car pull into the driveway. Lena stepped out first, my girl, all grown but still with that same hurried way of walking she'd had since she was a teenager. She smiled when she saw me, and for a moment, I felt the warmth that only a father's heart knows. Marcus followed, dragging his feet like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. His hair was a little too slick, his jacket too new for someone who hadn't worked in months. But it wasn't the clothes that caught my attention, it was his eyes. Even from the porch, I saw them flicker from my car to the garden shed, then to the windows of the house, like he was taking mental inventory. "Dad," Lena said, wrapping her arms around me. She smelled of rain and the faint lavender perfume her mother used to wear. I hugged her tightly, wishing the embrace could last a little longer. Marcus gave me a handshake, his palm damp and quick, as if even that small gesture was a chore. Inside, the air was warm from the wood stove. I'd spent the morning making the place look as welcoming as possible. Fresh flowers in the dining room, their old bedroom aired out and made up with new sheets. Lena noticed, thanking me as she set down her bag. Marcus, on the other hand, wandered from room to room, his gaze skimming over furniture, shelves, and closed doors. His footsteps were soft, but his presence felt loud. We sat down to dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from the garden. I'd opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. Lena chatted about her old job, the traffic, the rain. I listened, nodded, and kept my eyes on Marcus. He chewed methodically, barely joining in. When he did speak, it was to ask how long I'd been in the house, how many rooms it had, whether I kept much in the way of old mementos. It was the way he said it, offhand, as though it were harmless curiosity, but his eyes didn't match his voice. They were always searching, restless, as if they could pry open every locked drawer with just a glance. I didn't let on that I noticed. Years in the principal's office had taught me how to keep my face steady while my mind turned over a dozen thoughts. Lena reached for Marcus's hand at one point, smiling at him in that way people do when they're trying to reassure themselves. He smiled back, but I caught the flicker of impatience in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched like he wanted to be somewhere else entirely. When dinner was over, I poured coffee for Lena and Marcus. He thanked me, polite enough, but there was no warmth in it. I knew, right then, that Marcus's presence in my home wasn't going to be as simple as giving my daughter a place to stay. He thought he was the one watching me. He thought I was just an old man grateful for company. But as I watched him glance toward the study door, his mind clearly ticking away at some private plan, I felt the faint stirrings of something I hadn't in years, anticipation. Because if Marcus was going to play a game in my house, he had no idea just how good I was at winning. It didn't take long for Marcus to get comfortable in my home. A little too comfortable, if you asked me. By the third day, he was moving around as though he'd lived there for years, feet up on the coffee table, fridge door hanging open as he stared inside like the food might rearrange itself to his liking. Lena had started her new job, so during the day, it was just the two of us. Or rather, it was me in my workshop at the back of the house, and Marcus. Well, Marcus was organizing his things. That was the story, anyway. I'd hear his footsteps above me, moving from one room to another. Doors would open and shut. Sometimes a chair scraped across the floor. One afternoon, I went upstairs to get a book and found him in my study. He didn't see me at first. He was bent over my desk, flipping through a pile of old papers. When he realized I was in the doorway, he straightened up with a too bright smile. "Just looking for a place to set up my laptop?" he said, waving toward the desk, as if that explained everything. I nodded, but my eyes wandered past him to the corner where I kept an old steel safe. It was half hidden under a stack of file boxes. I'd put it there years ago and barely thought about it anymore. But now I noticed the way his gaze lingered on it, just for a second too long. That was all it took. I've seen the same look in the eyes of students when they spotted a teacher's answer key or a stash of confiscated candy. It's the look of someone seeing more than they should, someone thinking about how to get it. I said nothing. Instead, I mentioned that I needed to make a phone call and stepped out. From the hallway, I paused and listened. I heard the faint scrape of cardboard against metal as he shifted the files, probably to get a better look at the safe. That night, after Lena had gone to bed, Marcus and I found ourselves in the kitchen. I was rinsing a cup when he leaned against the counter, casual as you please. "So," he said, "what's in that big metal box in your study?" He didn't call it a safe. Maybe he thought that would make the question sound less pointed. "Looks like it's been there forever." I dried the cup slowly. "Just old things," I said. "Papers, maybe a few keepsakes. Haven't opened it in years." My voice was light, the kind of answer you give when you want someone to think it's not worth their time. But in my head, I marked it down. Marcus wasn't just curious, he was fishing. And a man doesn't go fishing unless he's hungry for something. He nodded like it was nothing, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the same glint I'd seen earlier in the study. I smiled faintly to myself as I went to bed that night. The game had begun, though Marcus didn't know it yet. And I'd been playing it far longer than he could imagine. The night it happened was unusually still for Portland. No rain tapping on the roof, no wind rattling the branches outside, just a calm, heavy quiet that made every small sound travel. I was in the living room, halfway through a book, when I heard it. A voice, low, muffled, coming from the back porch. I set the book down and listened. It was Marcus. The words were too faint to make out at first, just the soft rumble of a man trying not to be overheard. I eased out of my chair, the old floorboards creaking under my feet, and moved toward the hallway. The closer I got, the clearer his voice became, threading through the night air like a crack in a door. Draining the old man's stash, I froze. My pulse gave one hard thump. Enough to clear my debts. The words were sharper now, each one a knife twisting into my gut. Gone before she even knows. There it was, plain, unvarnished truth. No room for misinterpretation. He wasn't just curious about the safe. He had a plan. And in that plan, I was nothing more than an obstacle, or perhaps just a fool to be outmaneuvered. A cold heaviness settled in my chest, spreading outward like frost on glass. I stood in the shadows, listening to his voice dip and rise as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. I caught the sound of a laugh, a humorless, hard-edged sound. And imagined the smirk on his face as he pictured himself walking away with what was mine. It wasn't the money that stung me. Money comes and goes. It was the betrayal, the casual way he spoke about robbing me, the way he tossed my daughter's trust into the gutter without a second thought. I stepped back, careful not to make a sound. The urge to confront him right then and there surged in me like a rising tide. I could have flung the door open, demanded answers, shouted the truth loud enough for Lena to hear upstairs. But years of dealing with troublemakers, whether they were teenagers with contraband or staff who thought they could game the system, had taught me one thing. You don't interrupt a man when he's busy digging his own grave. So I let him keep talking. I slipped back into the living room, my mind working faster than my heart could keep up. I thought about Lena, how she defended him whenever I hinted at my doubts. I thought about the safe, the brass key, the way his eyes lit up like a predator spotting prey. By the time his footsteps came back inside, I was in my chair again, book open on my lap. He walked past without a word, not even glancing at me, and headed upstairs. I heard the bedroom door click shut. I stared at the same sentence in my book for a long time without reading it. The rainless night seemed heavier now, pressing against the windows. In my mind, the game had shifted. No more speculation, no more second-guessing. Now I had proof. And proof, I knew, could be more dangerous than any locked safe, especially when the man you're up against doesn't yet realize you're holding it. Confronting Marcus would have been the easy thing. One slammed door, one shouted accusation, and the whole charade would be over. But I've learned in life, and in the principal's office, that sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. That night, after I overheard his little confession on the porch, I lay awake with the plan forming in my mind. By morning, I knew exactly how I was going to play it. The first step was the safe. It hadn't been opened in years, not because I'd forgotten about it, but because what was inside wasn't anything I needed often. Old savings bonds, a few pieces of jewelry from my late wife, some cash I kept for emergencies. All things I valued, but not worth losing sleep over. I waited until Marcus was out, running some errand for Lena, or maybe just wandering around town, before I knelt in front of the safe. The air inside smelled faintly of metal and old paper. I pulled everything out, placing the real valuables into a locked trunk in the attic, one he'd never think to check. In their place, I arranged the bait. Imitation gold bars I'd once used as props for a school play. They were convincing at a glance. Solid, heavy, and gleaming just enough to catch the light. Around each, I carefully wrapped a die pack, the kind used in banks to mark stolen money. I'd kept them as curiosities after a safety training seminar decades ago, never thinking they'd serve a real purpose. The next step was trickier. I fetched a small motion-triggered camera from my workshop, a handy gadget I'd picked up years ago for monitoring the garden at night. With steady hands, I fixed it just inside the safe's doorframe, angled perfectly to capture the face of anyone who opened it. I tested it twice to make sure it would activate instantly. When I shut the safe again, I stood there for a long moment, resting my hand on the cold steel. My reflection stared back at me in its dull surface. This wasn't about the money. It was about seeing Marcus for who he truly was, and making sure Lena saw it too. The rest of the day, I acted as though nothing had changed. I read in my chair, tended to the garden, even shared a quiet dinner with Lena and Marcus. But under it all, there was a current of anticipation humming in my chest, a quiet readiness. Every glance Marcus gave me, every time he walked past the study door, I wondered if tonight would be the night. I wondered if his greed was strong enough to push him into action before he thought it through. When I finally went to bed, I left the key where I knew he'd look for it. I imagined him standing in the dark, the key cold in his palm, the safe's promise burning in his mind. And I smiled to myself in the quiet. Because sometimes, the best way to catch a thief is to let him believe he's already won. The house was still as a held breath. Even the old floorboards, usually quick to complain under the slightest weight, seemed to have fallen silent. I was in my bedroom, lights out, lying in the dark with my eyes open. Sleep wasn't on the agenda tonight. I'd left the key in the vase that morning, nestled just far enough down to look forgotten, but easy enough to find if one were looking for it. And I knew Marcus would be looking. His kind always did. I heard it then, the faintest shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like each one was measured. The sound moved toward the study. A pause. The whisper of a door easing open. In my mind, I could see him, slipping inside, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the house was still asleep. The click of the vase being moved. The soft rattle of the key in his hand. I stayed in bed, listening, every sound amplified in the darkness. The scrape of metal on metal as he knelt before the safe. The low, controlled breaths of a man trying to steady his nerves. Then came the telltale creak of the safe's heavy doors swinging open. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the house and the imagined sight of Marcus's eyes going wide at the gleam of the fake gold bars stacked neatly inside. His fingers, greedy and shaking, would have closed over the first one. That was when it happened. A sharp hiss, like a snake's breath, cut through the air, followed by a muffled pop. The die packs erupted in an angry cloud of crimson, splattering the study walls, soaking the carpet, and coating Marcus from head to toe. Even from my room, I heard his startled gasp, a raw, instinctive sound, ripped from him before he could contain it. I pictured the scene in perfect detail, the way he would stumble back, blinking through the stinging ink, his once slick hair dripping red, his hands stained like a man caught in the middle of a crime, which, of course, he was. The silence that followed was almost sweeter than the sound itself. I imagined him frozen, caught between the shock of what had just happened and the dread of what it meant. No doubt his mind was racing. How to clean it, how to explain it, whether to run or brazen it out. I stayed in my bed, letting the moment stretch. The trap had sprung exactly as I'd planned, and now he was standing in the wreckage of his own choices. Some people learn their lessons in classrooms, some in courtrooms. But Marcus? He was learning his in a small, dimly lit study, dripping with red and staring at the cold, unblinking eye of the hidden camera that had captured it all. And the best part? He didn't even know yet that I'd been awake the whole time. Smiling in the dark, I let him stew for a few minutes. Long enough for the shock to settle in, for the stinging dye to seep into his clothes and his skin, leaving a mark that wouldn't wash away easily. Then I rose from my bed, tablet in hand, and walked toward the study. The door was ajar. A thin line of red-stained carpet peeked through, like a warning flag. I pushed it open. Marcus froze where he stood, his hands half raised as if caught in the beam of a police spotlight. His shirt, his face, even his hair, everything was soaked in that deep, angry crimson. The fake gold bars lay scattered at his feet, gleaming dully under the study lamp. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint mechanical whir from inside the safe, the motion-triggered camera still recording, its tiny red light blinking steadily. I lifted the tablet so he could see. The screen played back the last 5 minutes in sharp, undeniable clarity. Marcus kneeling before the safe, the careful turn of the key, the gleam in his eyes as he reached for the gold. And then, boom, the dye bursting across his face like some terrible magic trick gone wrong. "This is live," I said quietly. My voice didn't need to rise. The truth was loud enough. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came out. The man who always had something slick to say suddenly had nothing. Then I heard the creak of the stairs. Lena's footsteps, quick, uneven, approaching. She appeared in the doorway, pulling her robe tight against the chill. At first, she looked at me, confused. Then her eyes shifted to Marcus, and the confusion bled into disbelief. "Marcus, what happened to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He started to stammer something, some excuse, no doubt, but I didn't give him the chance. I tapped the screen, and the video restarted. This time, Lena watched from the beginning, her gaze darting between the man she'd married and the man he was on screen. The further it played, the less she looked at him, and the more she stared at the floor, as if it might open up and swallow her. When the dye pack exploded, she flinched. When Marcus cursed under his breath on the recording, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. When the video ended, the room felt smaller somehow. He stood there, drenched and exposed, and she stood there, the weight of truth settling heavily on her shoulders. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The recording had spoken for me. Marcus was gone within 2 days. He didn't say goodbye. No apologies, no explanations. Just the sound of the front door closing early in the morning, the faint thud of his bag hitting the porch steps, and then the hum of an engine fading down the street. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. The red stains in my study told the whole story, their rusty hue already sinking into the carpet fibers. I knew I'd have to replace it eventually, but for now, I left it as it was. A reminder. Lena was quieter in those days. She moved through the house like she was walking through fog, her eyes avoiding the study altogether. I never pressed her for words. Some wounds don't bleed on the outside. They just ache, slow and deep. The second evening after he left, I made tea. It had always been a small ritual in our family. Tea in the evenings, a moment to pause no matter how hard the day had been. I carried 2 mugs to the kitchen table, steam curling into the dim light. She sat across from me, her robe wrapped around her like a shield. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clink of a spoon against porcelain, the soft hiss of rain finally returning outside. She kept her eyes on the tea, but I could see the tightness in her jaw, the kind that comes from holding back too much for too long. "Sometimes," I said finally, my voice steady, "losing someone is the only way to save yourself." Her head lifted slowly. She met my eyes, and for a second, I saw her as she'd been when she was little, wide-eyed, searching for reassurance, for something solid to hold on to. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. The small nod she gave me was enough to know the words had landed where they needed to. We sat there for a long time, sipping in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, not yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the kind of quiet you get after a storm, when the branches are still dripping and the air smells of earth, and you know the worst has passed even if the cleanup hasn't begun. Later, I walked her to the door of her room. She paused, looking down the hallway toward the study. The door was shut, but we both knew what was behind it. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm sorry." I shook my head. You don't owe me that. Just promise me you'll pay attention to the people you let into your life." She nodded again and went inside. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The house felt different, lighter, though nothing had physically changed. For the first time in a long while, I knew every person under my roof was here for the right reasons. The stains in the study would fade eventually, but the lesson wouldn't. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized something. Safety isn't just about locks and keys. It's about knowing you can close your eyes at night and trust the silence around you. For the first time in months, that silence felt like home. If you enjoyed Harold, Lena, and Marcus's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop your thoughts on what you feel about the story, rate it from 1 to 10, and tell us the city or country you're watching from. We'd love to know where our audience is.